Welcome to the 13th week after Pentecost. It is Wednesday, August the 21st, 2024. This is the Manna at the Tap podcast, where we as a community actively seek the spiritual nourishment our souls crave. I'm Gloria, your fellow traveler on this spiritual journey, and together we offer and receive insights and interpretations from the daily lectionary readings, which provide the manna designed to nurture our spiritual growth. During this season of Pentecost, we've been with Jesus as a crowd followed him. After teaching them, he knew they were hungry, so he asked the disciples how they would feed them. The answer the disciples offered Jesus was about the need for more resources. But Andrew, Peter's younger brother, found a child with the resources of 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish that were shared with Jesus, and he multiplied them to feed the crowd. That miracle of feeding was to a Jewish crowd of about 5,000. Today's lectionary reading is Mark chapter 8, which begins with another large crowd gathered around Jesus. This time, it's a crowd of Gentiles who've been with Jesus for 3 days and have had nothing to eat. Jesus looked at them with compassion, not wanting for them to make the journey home without eating because some had come a long distance. The disciples were concerned about the remote location they were in rather than about the resources that they had in their possession. You see, they had on hand 7 loaves. And Jesus told the crowd to sit on the ground. The disciples gave him the 7 loaves. He gave thanks, he broke them, and then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. It looked as if the disciples had held back the few small fish on hand, but finally they gave them to Jesus. Again, he gave thanks for the fish and also asked the disciples to distribute them to the crowd. The crowd ate and they were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 baskets of broken pieces of bread that were left over. The crowd of Gentiles numbered about 4,000. Jesus dismissed them and then got into a boat with his disciples to return to the Jewish territory. Jesus was met by Pharisees who questioned him and asked for a sign from heaven. He shook his head in disbelief and sighed deeply, and he told them there would be no sign given. Today's lectionary reading is Mark chapter 8, verses 14 to 21, which speaks of the misunderstanding between Jesus and his disciples. They were in the boat together as they crossed over to the other side of the lake when the disciples realized they'd forgotten to bring bread. But they still had a loaf in the boat with them. Jesus told them to be careful and watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. And Pharisees represented the religious group, and to watch out for the yeast of Herod that represented the government. Well, the statement confused the disciples as they discussed among themselves what was Jesus talking about. They were not on the same wavelength as Jesus as they expressed their worries about having no bread. They were confused, thinking his statement meant a lack of physical bread. Then this became a teaching moment between Jesus and his disciples. He began by asking them questions without waiting for an answer, but each question was framed by the repeated question, "Do you not understand?" I think Jesus was getting frustrated. The disciples were unknowingly becoming like the Pharisees, with hardened hearts, eyes that fail to see, and ears that fail to hear. The leaven of the Pharisees was their hypocrisy because they were entrenched in the law of Moses, and outwardly they appeared close to God, but in their hearts they were far from God. Now, Jesus was not telling them to guard against the yeast using bread, but to guard against the false teachings of the Pharisees who did not practice what they preached. They tied up heavy burdens that were hard to bear and laid them on the shoulders of people, but they were not willing to lift a finger to help anyone. For the Pharisees, it was all about being seen. And Jesus wanted his disciples to be aware of the false teachings and the attitudes of the Pharisees. Jesus then brought the focus back to himself by showing the disciples that they lacked the understanding that he was the one who provided for them. He is God, the miracle worker, who fed the crowd of 5,000. And there were 12 baskets of leftover bread. They had just experienced another feeding, the feeding of the 4,000 Gentiles, and they were 7 baskets of leftover bread. He taught his disciples not to worry about their physical provisions because they were cared for by a God who was abundantly able to provide for them as he had provided for the crowds that followed him. I think this is an opportunity today for us to think about how we view God. Do we view God as the one who cares for us, or do we think we have to be worried about how we are going to be provided for?